Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe. Followers, likes, double tap. Now they control your life, Dopamine swipe.
What is going on, beautiful people? Welcome back to the 817 podcast, where we talk about the lovely city of Fort Worth, Texas. We get into politics, culture, business, city planning. You name it, we discuss it. Ann, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm getting ready to leave the country on Tuesday.
Yes.
So, I don't know. I was joking around about like doing some mic dropping and then leaving the country for 3 weeks, but I'm not sure that'll actually happen.
We have a lot of stories that can maybe, boil some water, so we can have some
and then I'll just
hot
leave
takes.
you here to deal with the fallout.
Yeah, and here's the cool thing too, though. I will not be here as well next week, but then the next 2 weeks we'll have guests participating as Ann is gone. You also did the Hispanic Chamber
Gala.
The
The
How was
50th
that?
celebration last night. It was fantastic. They recognized 50 emerging I think 50 emerging leaders and 50 stalwart people who've been, leaders in the Hispanic community for many, many years. And there were 1,200 people, I think, at the gala, and it was a smashing success. And actually, our landlord here in our podcast studio, Blank Studio, was the businessman of the year, and he was there to accept that award.
I love it. So, that was going on. So we had some people in the building, and we're able to show just kind of what's going on in Fort Worth. So that's a huge shout out there. But let's go ahead and talk about what's in front of all newspapers this Sunday, Monday, and that is Ken Paxton being acquitted on all charges by the Senate. The historic vote Saturday came after 2 weeks of trial that brought into focus sharp divides within the state's Republican Party. Paxton was only the third state official to be impeached in Texas history and the first to survive to remain in office. He has denied the allegations that included providing legal favors to a political donor and retaliating against whistleblowers in his own office. Suspended since his impeachment by the House in May, Paxton has now been reinstated. Obviously, this has created some heat between Dade Phelan and Patrick around just beef within the Republican Party. I guess the other things to kind of note here, too, is that Tarrant County Judge Tim O'Hare blames the corrupt media for trying to impeach Paxton and that this was a waste of state dollars to be running this trial. So Tim tweeted on X about how Republicans should never read, watch, or consume anything from corrupt media sources. So pretty much everything we read is not qualifiable.
They listed off the Star Telegram, the Dallas Morning News, the Houston Chronicle, all of the media sources, he says, are suspect and should not be trusted, I guess. I don't know. My overall takeaway from this is something a little bit removed from just the facts of the impeachment trial and the take that our local county judge had. But going back to kind of the beef between Phelan and the lieutenant governor, that some of the Republicans have criticized the speaker on his processes of allowing Democrats to lead certain committees. And their take on it was that, you get in here, you win, you represent the people who elected you, and basically, I guess, nobody else, because they wanted him to not allow any Democrats to lead any committees or be in positions of leadership. So like the vice chair of a committee. Clearly, they're in control, but when you get elected, even if you get elected by, say, 60%, which is a big chunk, there are still folks out there who did not vote for you. And in my opinion, you still represent those people, and you still have an obligation to hear what they have to say and take into consideration what they have to say. And you should have an open mind to the opinions of people who maybe didn't support you in your election. And this idea that you're just going to block out a whole other half sometimes, I mean, maybe a little less than half, because clearly you won the majority and that was more than half, and that you're just not going to allow those people to have a say or be a voice or participate in leadership, I think is really disturbing. And that is frustrating to me. Yeah.
And I think the split in the Republican Party is on full display here in Texas. It kind of reminds me similar to what's going on federally between like the Trump camp and the establishment, Nikki Haley kind of types. But now you're seeing that, I feel like, in Texas as well. And I think the challenge, too, is, though, that so many of the cities vote Democrat. So is there enough of these, what I would call cordial, normal, livable Republicans that we can operate with rather than like this Dan Patrick, obviously O'Hare, and Paxton camp of, anything Democrat is or progressive is bad.
And boiling it down to like the local level, it's kind of that loud voices in the room. You're not just representing loud voices in the room, the people who have the ability to show up for one meeting or multiple meetings. You need to be having your finger on the pulse of a broader citizenry so that you're actually representing all the people, even the people who might not be able to be there to speak for themselves.
To me, why I think this is a big loss for Texas is that the evicting of Paxton wasn't about if he broke the law or not. It was they were supposed to come together and measure, was his conduct fit for him to continue to be in public office. Now, there still can be a reckoning for Paxton because he still has to deal with security fraud and an FBI investigation about Nate Paul, the person he was doing favors for, allegedly. So that's federal court trials that he has to still manage. What is annoying about this whole situation is that the Texas GOP is trying to make it as a victory, trying to show that his record is clean and that all of this was wasted time and taking state tax dollars. They're even coming at Dade Phelan's neck, wanting him to resign.
Yeah, and Phelan's comments, were basically pointing out that Patrick's closing remarks as the judge, the quote-unquote judge over this trial, in his closing remarks, he made some comments that made it pretty clear that he was not impartial in his thinking.
And that's why he's, I think that the most powerful person in Texas politically, because of his ability to sit as judge with clearly still being biased. And for Tim O'Hare and his comments about journalism, this is why, I think it's when you see national polls about who do you trust, Democrats and Republicans actually really agree on like politicians. Like, do you trust your politicians? And it's like 40% say no. But like when it comes to journalism, Democrats are like 80% trust, and then Republicans are like 20%. So just this language really, I feel like always really hurts journalism, is when they get in the shot fires of keeping people in power accountable, regardless if they're Republican or Democrat.
I know. I think that looking back over the years, our local paper has been criticized from both sides. Like I read the paper and then I hear people complaining, it has a liberal bias. For years, people were saying the Star Telegram had a liberal bias. And now people are saying, it has a conservative bias. And I think when you report the news and do it impartially, whatever you're reporting on is going to have some, when you're talking about politics, will have some political leaning to it. So if you have the need to constantly criticize, then I guess you're going to be able to find ways to criticize. But it's important for all of these media options to exist so that we know what the heck is going on.
Yeah, and they call that in journalism school lateral reading, right? Rather than vertical reading. People usually pick one source, if it's Fox or Star Telegram or whatever your thing is, and you just read vertically up and down that one website. Lateral reading is going across tabs and across sources. And so you should read the Star Telegram story of an outcome locally and the Fort Worth report. And then if there is a Dallas Business Journal article about it too, that also works. And I love when Dallas Morning News also writes something about Fort Worth, because you get kind of a peer outtake that's different than what you would see from Star Telegram.
Yeah, that reminds me, this is totally off topic, but I remember one time we went to Dallas and we were spending the night over there, and I was looking for a copy of the Star Telegram to read on a Sunday morning and could not find a Star Telegram anywhere in Dallas. And I thought, we have Dallas Morning News all over
100.
Fort Worth. Why in the world can I not get the Star Telegram in Dallas? But that was many, many years ago. It's probably still the case, but.
And this is what I think is like how you keep the American citizens ignorant, is by not giving them and promoting diverse perspectives and advocating for diverse town halls and publications that allows people to see different realities and audit their own reality, even if it makes them uncomfortable.
Oh, it's part of the reason that my husband gets upset with me, because I get myself so worked up that I'm reading certain things that maybe does bring up a point of view that is, not my point of view, and I get upset about it. And then he's like, why are you exposing yourself to these things? But I think you and I agree. Yeah. It's important to be exposed to all of these ideas and know what other people are thinking about and what motivates them. It's
mental fitness, right? I mean, it would be like lifting weights, and when it starts getting hard, you stop. That's where you're growing that muscle. And so I just feel like, O'Hare wants people to stay ignorant and just lost in his sauce, so that they just listen to the same radio station or YouTube influencer that just feeds dopamine to their subjective view of the world. So, that's already an early loss. But as you know, that's common on this episode and this podcast when it comes to the county. Now, let's go ahead and dive into story 2.
Absolutely. That's a story that I shared with you earlier this week because the title grabbed my attention. This is the article that came out actually from the city of Fort Worth in their city news, that CCPD's budget proposal for safer streets and stronger communities. And I shared this with you with great enthusiasm before reading the article, thinking that possibly there was going to be some CCPD dollars going towards actual physical improvements to streets that would make them safer. We've bumped up against quite a bit of, talking about street racing in the past, road takeovers, parking lot takeovers. And I thought, well, maybe somebody got the brilliant idea that you could put some of these public safety dollars towards physical improvements to a street that might make it safer. But that's not really what this was proposing. It was just basically talking about overall safety on the streets. And I think the solution is more police. But on this, they basically break down the amount of money that the city council conducted a public hearing to vote on the approval of the crime control and prevention district budget. That was approved back in 1995 to supplement the police budget and receive a half cent of the city's sales tax. And small note, in 2020, voters renewed the district for 10 years. So before 2020, this was voted on every 5 years.
Yeah, that's painful.
Yeah, a little bit for me.
Yeah, that's very painful.
A little PTSD here. I had proposed that we take a look at providing a little more funding for public transportation. And it wasn't taking money away from CCPD at all. It was looking at property tax funding for public transportation. And because of a lack of a quorum, when a couple of council members didn't show up for a meeting, we actually just weren't able to continue the conversation about that. But when the idea of extending the time frame of which we vote on CCPD was brought up in 2020 and changing that from an every 5-year vote to an every 10-year vote, I expressed concern that that would lock in that half cent of funding to this specific thing only and not allow us to have the conversation about possibly funding more transit. In other cities, they put a full cent towards transit. In Fort Worth, half a cent goes to transit, half a cent goes to CCPD. And like the article states, this was created in 1995 because there was a significant crime issue in the city of Fort Worth. And so that was why it was created. But it grows every year because it's based on sales tax. And so there are some programs within it that are community-based programs, and those are the programs that I have encouraged folks to take a closer look at and apply for. Nonprofits throughout the community that do work in the community to combat crime could be funded out of this CCPD. But they list off here in the article the budget highlights that, and I don't know, you're going to put it in the show notes. I don't know if we necessarily need to read them off.
I mean, you can maybe read one that you feel like is interesting. Like, one is $4 million to replace the helicopter. I think that's interesting. But the other one is, I know we talked last week about there's $11.3 million for resource officers at 50 area schools.
$6 million for city departments supporting crime prevention, either through the graffiti abatement, community center programs, parks and safety, and then the $4.5 million for crisis intervention officers to work with individuals in mental health crises. And then $1.5 million for the HOPE officers to help people experiencing homelessness. But if you look at the list, it starts with the bigger numbers, $15.3 million for neighborhood patrol officers, which I think is a really good program. Those neighborhood patrol officers are in the neighborhoods, getting to know the people in the neighborhoods.
We're spending more money on bicycle officers than people who can assist with mental health services.
Hopefully there's some cross-training so all of these officers are adept at dealing with that. But yeah, that's what I was kind of looking at, the difference between the things that are at the top of the pyramid, or the top of the funding, and the things that are getting the least amount of funding. And the ones for mental health crisis intervention and the HOPE officers are getting, the smaller amount.
And I remember Fort Worth ISD saying, they were not going to hit that resource officer bill because they said they need, I want to say that article was close to $20 to $25 million. So you're still underserviced to meet the needs of the state for having a resource officer.
The state mandate, yeah.
In every school. So,
which an argument could be made that you need more funding for that. And so my idea of ever being able to look at this funding for other things like transportation is not likely to happen if the state continues to mandate things that then the city has to find the funding to accommodate.
Yep. Well, this is already approved, so we're going to see this be implemented in the city. And it's just a example how connected the CCPD is to the foundational design and development of the culture of our city.
Yeah, and back to my point of what I thought might be included in the funding, reading the title, I think that might not be a bad idea. So if there's somebody out there who is doing that kind of work, I actually suggested to Trinity Metro, our transit authority, that they look at possible funding in CCPD for improvements at bus stops, because that could be a crime prevention thing, providing safe bus stops with lighting and on-time notification of when the bus is going to be there, and those sorts of things could lead to a safer infrastructure in our city.
All right, so let's go ahead and move into the third story, which is another post by the city. This is about housing affordability as we deal with growth. You also attended the city council meeting here. So, Anne, go ahead and bring in story number 3.
Yeah, so there was this started off with a city article that was shared on September 7th that between the sky-high interest rates, low inventory and property taxes, and the price to own or rent a home keeps rising. So the city saw that a solution to this, or an avenue to address this, would be to bring in a consultant to look at the housing crisis in 2023 and look at effective ways that people across the country are addressing this, and come up with some suggestions and ideas for the city of Fort Worth. And out of that consultant work came the Neighborhood Conservation Plan and Housing Affordability Strategy, which is to provide a roadmap and a plan for investing in neighborhoods and providing stable housing so that Fort Worth families can thrive. And the plan is also strategic because it's got resources. There are limited resources, but this gives ideas of solutions to those complex problems so that hopefully in the future we can invest in ways that are deliberate and based on data so that those resources can be stretched as far as possible. This plan was presented at a couple of public meetings with community stakeholders. It was presented to the council in their work session the week prior to their putting it on the agenda to adopt by resolution, and then be attached to the comprehensive plan so that it could be a tool to be used going forward. But at the council meeting where they were set to take action on adopting the plan, a few people showed up with concerns about one of the suggestions in the plan. And that suggestion was taking a look at allowing accessory dwelling units. And in the strategic plan, it suggested that that could be something that would be allowed citywide, or it could be something that would be allowed in appropriate districts. And it didn't dictate that or suggest that that was a tool that was required for the city to do. But because of the concerns that were raised at the meeting, the council chose to pause the approval of the affordable housing strategy to address some of those concerns. So I actually attended that meeting because affordable housing is something that is important to me personally and to the work that I continue to do in the community. And my comments were basically, this is a strategic plan provided by a consultant who has access and information to resources and tools from across the entire country of things that have worked in other places that are possible potential things that the city could consider, while tweaking them further and taking into consideration, local on the ground conditions and the input from folks. And so that I didn't feel it was advantageous to start eliminating some of the tools from the toolbox before we've even kind of looked at them through the lens of Fort Worth. But I understand the pausing to take a closer look, and they have postponed a vote on that for a couple October 17th. So they'll come back to that then and take a look at that.
And it looks like it was the ADUs, the accessory dwelling units, that created the most pushback or conflict within the report about strategies on how to solve the problem.
And that could be a standalone structure. It could be an apartment above an existing garage. It could be a garage with an apartment above built, new. There are accessory dwelling units throughout the city of Fort Worth now. If you go to older neighborhoods especially, they exist. Some of them are in areas that allow them to be rented out separately from the house. Some of them are grandfathered to do that because the current zoning wouldn't allow you to do that. And some of them are probably illegally being that happening.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also places where people would like to do that, but the current zoning doesn't allow that to happen. And, I had a couple people who expressed concern in the beginning and were saying they didn't want this because historically, in areas like around universities, so specifically TCU, there's been concerns that it wouldn't just be an accessory dwelling. A family lives in the main house and rents out the garage to a student, for example. The concern is that because of the demand of housing in an area like that, that the whole thing becomes rental housing for students. And so then you have multiple students living in the house, multiple students living in the accessory dwelling unit, and all of those people are adults. So all of those people have cars. And so I understand the unintended consequences, concerns that people have, and it tends to come down to parking very, very often, but that density in parking. But I think just saying no eliminates the possibility for other things that are absolutely helpful and beneficial to homeowners. So say you live in your home and you have an elderly parent who is no longer going to live on their own, and you want to keep them close. So that intergenerational housing is an option with accessory dwelling units. Or a child boomerangs and comes back and needs a place to live. So I think that there are absolute benefits to it, and it also gives someone who might need some rental income to assist them to be able to stay in their home. So say their taxes are going up and it's a challenge to be able to stay in their home. If they were to have an accessory dwelling unit that they could rent out, that would bring income that could benefit that. And it does, one of the comments that has been made is, it increases the value of that property, which makes those homes more expensive. So is it really adding to the affordable housing? And I think if you evaluate every single suggestion of housing and say it doesn't fix the whole problem or it's not the complete answer, then you're never going to do anything.
Yeah.
But if you look at every little opportunity or idea and say, how could this be a part of the picture? And what are the unintended consequences that could happen? And what kind of tools can we put in place to alleviate those unintended consequences? It's a conversation to be had. And if everybody just digs in their heels and says, no, I'm refusing to speak about this, this is a deal breaker for me, I'm just going to say no, I just think that stalls out conversations similarly to all the political nonsense we're dealing with.
Yeah. So like macro level, looking at like the relationship between developers and the government or cities, is a lot of people concerned about this because they see what happened to Airbnb, and once Airbnb was set up, it was like, oh, it was all fun and games until it got super commercialized and people started basically building and buying houses just to make Airbnbs, and then now the locals didn't have anywhere to live, like in Waco or Fredericksburg. Like, are people afraid that this ADU model could get into the hands of people who see a way to make a lot of money?
Well, I think we've touched on a couple of articles in the past about corporations coming in, investment people coming in and buying large swaths and then turning it all into rental. And then that's not providing housing that's available for folks to buy and live in. And I think those are the types of tools we need to put in place to make sure that those things don't happen. And in Texas, we tend to shy away from regulation and leave things to the market. And that's where you can get in. There's going to have to be some regulations put in place to alleviate that from happening. Yeah. Because I think that can be detrimental to a neighborhood and change a character of a neighborhood and turn it into, and that's why partially the idea of only allowing it in specific places can be a problem. If you allow it more broadly, then the likelihood of it completely changing the character of one area is less. Yeah. And if you only allow it, if you disallow it in places where people show up to a meeting and say they don't want it, then the neighborhoods that maybe don't have the political clout and the wherewithal to show up and have their voices heard, it gets concentrated in those places. But in my experience, in the places where they have allowed it, and they started off with a lot of concerns about how it could go terribly wrong or there might be unintended consequences, and they've put into place very strict regulations to try to keep those things from happening, they've bumped up against basically not having any produced. And so they didn't get any more units. And so they've had to go back in and kind of start taking away some of those regulations in order to get more people to utilize that resource and build those units. So Portland is an example of a place that allowed it, but with a lot of restrictions, and then didn't get any built, and then slowly kind of started taking back some of those regulations and slowly started getting a few more of them being available. But I swear all of this comes back around to people being concerned about cars and parking and congestion and too many people being in places. And what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do we have people and then that supports other forms of transportation, or do we figure out a way to fund that transportation before we have the people? Because I constantly hear criticism of the transportation that we have not being utilized. And, we are a place that people have been used to getting around in their cars. So there is a point to that. But I think a point to saying, well, that's not who we are. We're not going to be people who utilize other forms of transit. But if we don't put up some kind of wall around us and say nobody else can move here, people are going to continue to move here. They're going to continue to need to live places. If they live further and further out from the city where there are less of the things that people want, like community centers and shopping and all of the things, then they're going to have to get in their cars to drive places. And then we're going to continue to sprawl those resources out. And that, I think, leads to the neglect of the older parts of the city and the core of the city. If we allow some of that growth to occur in the locations where those facilities already exist, there is going to be a pinch point of more people in an area. And if they're all driving, having it be a little more congested. So you still are going to deal with that. So I err on the side of supporting better, more robust transit and more diverse housing types. And while it can be painful at points, I think in the long run, we'll end up with a better overall result.
Yeah, no. And it's an idea that popped in my head because around the transportation, people are so negative about the usage of transportation. I think it'd be cool for, like, I don't know who would do this if it's Trinity Metro, but like 1 week, all home associations, like their whole meeting is on the bus in their neighborhood, and then they have to go to downtown. Yeah, and like then they can make the complaints, but then like if you as a home association is bringing your neighbors to it together and then seeing how it works, because to me that's the thing is I just haven't tried it for my neighborhood, but like can I get to downtown and be okay with 15 20 minutes extra time, but now I'm taking the bus rather than driving downtown like I always do. I don't know, and if you're able to do that as home associations, let's say the first week of November, home associations have an event, and the event is to ride the bus down to, downtown, and it's a partnership with Trinity Metro or something.
Trinity Metro and Tarrant Transit Alliance have both done those kind of Transit 101 things, not specifically on a neighborhood, but like with Steer Fort Worth, they did one, and we all rode the bus to the train to the stockyard. I mean, the bus to the, I think it was the train and then the bus. And then Trinity Metro used to have somebody on staff who was going around to all the neighborhood associations. She moved away, and I miss her very much, Tyler. But she used to go to all the neighborhood association meetings and present like what is available transit-wise to you. And, I am constantly hearing from folks who know that I'm very passionate about transit, and they ask me questions about how to get places, and they give me the input of how it could be made better. Clearly, if you are comparing driving your car to getting on a bus in Fort Worth, Texas, it's going to take longer. I believe that we should work on making that better so that not only do the people who rely on that transportation have a better experience, the people who wish to take that alternative type of transit will be more inclined to do so because the service is more frequent and the time it takes to get to those places is not twice as long, which it can be in some cases because we underfund our public transportation system.
Yeah. I like the Steer Fort Worth idea. I think I've done something like that with like another class, but it's like if we can do it directly from our house, like that same experience, because I'm only at Steer Fort Worth at that event for a work job, but if I get that same experience directly from my home, then it makes it more real that I could do, like you as a person can do this. Like I feel like,
I think that Trinity Metro or Tarrant Transit Alliance both could put out information maybe in a marketing campaign to say from this neighborhood, this is the experience. I mean, I know it because I've done it multiple times with the Transit Go Pass app to see if I could get to this meeting or that meeting in another way other than driving. So if more people would just try that, it's kind of like telling people to use the Fort Worth app to turn in things. Just go on the Go Pass app and experiment with what it looks like getting places from your house.
All righty. Well, this is moving into the big story, which it seems like economic development and growth has constantly been the big story. There's just a lot of things moving, not just people into the city, but also just projects. So we're going to talk about Alliance. We're going to talk about Veal Ranch, and then we're also going to talk about highways, US 81 and 287 in Northwest Tarrant County, and just managing population boom. So this is 3 stories. I'll go ahead and start with the first one. The first one I'd like to talk about is basically the industrial growth filling warehouses in Fort Worth. Alliance is continuing to thrive with adding additional and when I say Alliance, we're talking about Hillwood being able to launch 2 new industrial buildings, Alliance Center East 2 and Alliance Center East 3. Each are 225,000 square feet, bringing nearly 500,000 square feet to Alliance Texas industrial market. Speculative industrial buildings are constructed without a lease. So they're preparing for the size. And to me, it's just, I think there's going to be a master class on whatever Alliance is trying to achieve when it comes to mobility. But it's just showing that continues to happen. It's also showing just the demand, raising the rates in Fort Worth when it comes to industrial renting has gone up as well. So when people talk about rents going down because people are not doing office space, we're seeing actually rates go up here in Fort Worth when it comes to warehousing and rents for that kind of businesses. We see rent prices have grown 13% in Fort Worth in the second quarter, according to Transwestern. You have to be aware, we talked about this already, but the China-based provider of advanced products, John Chuang. You also have what's the drink pack one, which that's not Alliance, but you're seeing more and more people come to the city.
So this article about the industrial growth filling warehouses in Fort Worth touched both on speculative building because they know that demand is coming, and also filling the spaces that exist. It talked about Alliance, and it also talked about the Carter Park area, which is south Fort Worth, east of I-35. And so I think both of those places are growing and booming, and those are being filled, and that market seems to be on the rise. And those things, I mean, North Fort Worth is built out, and there's probably a lot of folks in that area that can fill those jobs, and then it's just a matter of getting kind of around in those areas. And then the southeast Fort Worth growth is providing jobs in an area that I think needs those jobs. So I think that both of those are growth things that are beneficial as far as providing employment for folks here and tax base paid for other than by single family homes.
Yeah.
So then the second article is a Fort Worth Report article talking about West Fort Worth Ranch could become Center for Economic Development. And I believe that some of this was on the council agenda last Tuesday, but they're asking, what does economic development in West Fort Worth look like? And saying that the answer might just be VL Ranch. And the city council approved this week a special taxing district to fund infrastructure and improvements on a 5,300 acre parcel of ranch land. So this is a little bit of the opposite of kind of infill in area that's already developed. This is continuing to grow further out from the core of the city. And I believe it is both a commercial and residential development. But the city is talking about the fact that in the past, when there have been economic development deals to be had, that maybe there wasn't an area identified with infrastructure available for those things to go into. And so that's their reasoning for incentivizing and building a tax increment district and a public improvement district for this area to pay for the public infrastructure, so that this is an area that's ready and available. And I understand that, but my only caveat and concern is that the next article we're going to talk about talks about highway expansion of US 81 and 287, and it is talking about tackling the Northwest Tarrant County population boom. And I foresee, if not carefully considered, similar problems happening in West Fort Worth. And in fact, I think some of them are already starting to materialize, that have happened in far North Fort Worth. And that is a lot of growth without a lot of infrastructure. And so I would hope that this West Fort Worth infrastructure is done in a way that doesn't lead us to then having to be like, oh, we need to expand these roads, we need to expand these highways in order to accommodate all this. And it's continued growth that is not accessible or easily served by other modes of transportation. And therefore, it is more cars and more people in individual cars. And then you get to a point where you're like, okay, well, then the answer is to expand the highways. And I just wish that there was a way to proactively build and incentivize things that didn't lead us down that road, if that makes sense. Oh, that road, listen to that.
Yeah, and I mean, what's also interesting, Hazlitt saw a 31% increase in its population since 2022, the second largest percentage increase in population in North Texas. So when you talk about like the area of the highway and what they're looking to fund, and obviously the crazy bottlenecks that are up there. The other part though, it talks about how Hazlitt's looking to double, and like by 2050. So it says the city of Hazlet is expected to double its population by 2050. Nearby cities like Saginaw, Blue Mound are also expected to grow their population by 21%, 33%. I mean, these are areas, I mean, Hazlet's 25, 30 minutes from downtown Fort Worth. I wonder if this acceleration obviously is pandemic. People maybe decide to go out on a sprawl because they wanted bigger now that everyone had to work from home and they needed more space. I don't know if that had to do anything with it. What is your take on that population boom and how Hazlets have been created? Does a Veal Ranch kind of create that kind of energy? Like Alliance is in between Hazlet and Fort Worth. Veal Ranch will be between whatever's left of Veal Ranch and cities that are starting to boom as well.
On the west side. Yeah, years ago, the city of Fort Worth, because we're huge geographical area, like square miles wise, we're very, very large. And that is what leads to difficulty in providing services to all of that area. And back then we decided that we were not going to be annexing as much in our extraterritorial jurisdiction, which is the area 5 miles around the perimeter of the city that is the city's to annex if it so wishes. And the policy at that time was to change and not continue to do that annexation, except for in pockets that were completely surrounded by the city already, which kind of makes sense because you don't want a little donut hole in the middle that's not part of the city. In this case, we're talking about both Tarrant and Parker counties that are portions that are in the city's extraterritorial jurisdiction. And so I think what the clarification of the policy is that we weren't going to be annexing involuntarily, but if people owned land and wanted to be annexed into the city, that would be something the city would consider. And that's what is happening in this case, that this is a property owner that wants to develop and wants to be annexed into the city. And so the city is looking at issuing bonds to do the improvements of these areas and to provide all of this. And I just think it's incentivizing the sprawl, which we've run into problems with in North Fort Worth. As far as what is the demand for this, I think that there are demands for all types of housing. I think there are studies that show that there are people who want to live in walkable urban neighborhoods, which you have more so in the core of the city. And there are studies that show that people want to be in an area where they have a little more leg room around them, land around them, their neighbors are not so close to. And so I think that you can have both of those things. But if you're not going to provide services in those areas within a certain reasonable distance, you're going to have more people having to drive further distances. And so that I was listening to a podcast this morning that touched on sustainability and air quality and, tailpipe emissions. And it was basically saying, is it more environmentally sustainable to have density and more people living in the core, or to continue to have the sprawl? And it's that distance of driving that adds more, I think, to the pollution issue and makes it less environmentally.
Does that possibly change if it's electric or what?
Well, that's the other thing they talked about too. That it can, but I think that still has more people, clogging up the roads with the cars. So it doesn't necessarily alleviate all the problems. It might alleviate some of the problems of the pollution. That's
where I feel like I'm someone who's not like, this is not my passionate wheelhouse of what changing the landscape of society for me. But like, I see the entrepreneur in me sees this like something that's never been done before is out there that needs to happen for Texas, because I feel like unlike Oregon or Seattle, like Portland or Seattle or heck, New England and Connecticut and Boston, where the states are smaller, like Texas does have a lot of space. And I don't know, like, what does the future, and it's like the sprawl's already happening. Like, how do you connect Hazlet and Fort Worth with public transportation? I feel like we would have to create the future model that is more made for large places like Texas that doesn't exist currently as a model in, I feel like, the United States.
Well, that's the key word being in the United States.
Yeah.
Because when I went to Budapest, there were very rural places connected by transit.
Yeah.
And I have a friend who lives in Germany, and she said the same thing. Like, you walk through the forest and get on a bus that took you to the train that took you into the major city.
Yeah.
And so in other places, there have been the ability to connect more sprawled rural places to the core.
Yeah.
And so people didn't have to all drive. And I think that the concern with that third article that we talked about with US 81 and 287 reconstruction to tackle the Northwest Tarrant County population boom, we're literally seeing what could possibly happen in West Fort Worth if we're not more intentional. Because basically there are people who have moved to an area, and there's farm to market roads, and they're connected to highways, and in some places not connected to the highways. And so it's just become a big bottleneck. And so, but when you read this article, it's so clear that the focus is on the commuter going through a place and not so much the people that are in that place. And so they complain about congestion and 2 lanes and the things that have been put in place to make sure that traffic is slowed in order to make the places safer for the people who are in those places, and counterbalance it with how fast can we get people that are going through this place through. And I think that just ends up with a place that no one wants to be in except for in their car.
Yeah.
And that's challenging. So they're adding new lanes and ramps, and all of this has been funded through TxDOT. And my understanding is that congestion is not solved by adding more capacity. More capacity just induces more people to drive and more growth to happen in the way that will continue to just fill up that capacity. So it'll take until 2030 to do these improvements. And by the time we get to 2030, there's going to be more people, and it'll be just congested again. I think that the highway expansion that is pointed to often is the 405 in Los Angeles. It literally opened up and was filled up immediately, and there was no congestion relief. So congestion relief is not achieved by adding more lanes when the growth is continuing to occur. Congestion relief is achieved by allowing other ways of getting around so that not everybody is driving on the highway.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we will, I guess, continue to obviously talk about the developments of economic development. Should we, why are we not any negative, but we're building this sprawl to develop and have market ready land for large companies to move here. I know that's always been a priority for the economic development of Fort Worth. And but we're also then talking about the natural growth of Fort Worth without all these large companies already being here. And so it all kind of interweaves together. And always we love your opinions and feedback on any of this.
And my overall thoughts on all 3 of these articles is that I just feel like we continue to either let development happen in a market-driven way or actually incentivize growth patterns that will lead to dissatisfaction in the future. So I think that it's very self-serving, I guess, but it all comes down to city planning. And if we plan and think about these things more carefully and collaborate together across jurisdictions and departments, I think that we can end up with better results.
I also agree. So this was our big story. We will see what happens as they push back the agenda to October 17th. Let's go ahead and move into wins and losses.
So my loss this week was brought up from a Texas Tribune article that Texas political environment is driving faculty to leave, survey finds. The political climate in Texas is leading contributors to professors' desires to leave the state. A new survey of more than 1,900 Texas faculty members found more than a quarter of those professors said that they plan to look for positions elsewhere in the country this year as a result of the political interference and widespread dissatisfaction with the state's higher education in Texas. So I think most people are aware of some of the legislature's ideas for trying to reshape higher education in Texas universities, which has resulted in 2 pieces of legislation that eliminated diversity, equity, and inclusion, and made some changes to tenure. And I think that this is a loss because basically it is leading to folks who are working in our universities thinking that this might not be the best place to be. And I no longer have kids that are going to college, but I know many of you do. And mine went out of state to go to college, and I miss them very much, but I think this might lead to more kids going out of state for college. And when you go somewhere for college, you often stay there. And so all of the talk that we have about wanting to have places for our community to be able to stay here and housing for our students and jobs for, young people so that they stay in Fort Worth, I think this is just another contributing factor that might thwart that.
Your kiddos never came back, huh?
Not yet. I don't see them coming back anytime soon. I can barely get them to visit me, but thankfully they live in a place I like to visit, so I can go see them.
Well, my loss is something you brought to us. But you know what's going to be crazy? I didn't have a win. You remember I said I'll figure out my win? I found a way to bring my win together with my loss.
Oh, look, I have an influence on you.
Yeah, and I'm gonna try to make this work. So the loss is Texas paid Bitcoin miner Riot $31.7 million to shut down during the heat wave in August. Riot has been the least performing mining company of the ones that have all been performing pretty poor in 22 in 23 compared to in 21 when Bitcoin really took a rise. But I just think it's wild that ERCOT had the Electric Reliability Council of Texas has incentives to give credits to Riot, which was $24.2 million for energy sold back to ERCOT, plus $7 million in demand response credits asking to shut down. And to me, this is Riot's only way of actually making any money. So it's technically, like, to me, the crazy part about this story about our state paid tax dollars to Riot to stop mining Bitcoin because of we were at top level of performance. It's just crazy because Riot as a business is basically to suck as much energy as possible so that the way they make business is that when we tap as a state, they then get paid tens of millions of dollars. What a crazy business model. You talk about a business model is not made by actually making a financial market. It's really just draining electricity until states pay you to stop. That is just a big loss. And that when we talk about like the things that we waste money on, and if anyone tells you we waste money on things, our state is paying tens of millions of dollars to a Bitcoin company. Now, positive. All right, I have no very positive. I'm not a Bitcoin person, but I am an innovation person, and I am someone who promotes Fort Worth participating in innovative discussions. So my win, though, is the North American Blockchain Summit, which is November 15th to the 17th. So for Fort Worth to participate and be the organizing city for a national discussion on what should this new innovative industry look like, the fact that that's going to be in Fort Worth is a win. So, and what's cool about that, what that brings here, it brings people like Andrew Yang to Fort Worth. It brings people like Balaji Srivastava, who's a big tech guy and had a great book about the network state. It brings really important leaders who are discussing this stuff to Fort Worth, and for that, I think is a win. And if I'm in town, I'll probably go. And heck, I know the guy's been trying to get one of the people running it is trying to get on the pod. Maybe I can get him on the pod while you're while you're gone.
Well, it seems like we're both pro discussion happening around a lot of topics. So that was very clever how you did that. I applaud your loss and your win. So my win, if you just read the title to the article that sparked off this win, you might think, why in the heck is she thinks this is a win? Because this is an article by the Fort Worth Report Deep dive, segregation hampered Fort Worth's aquatics. Here's how the city could recover its pools. And this is a very extensive article, which I think was very well written by Rachel Byrne. I can't pronounce last names. I'm terrible. Rachel with the Fort Worth Report. I apologize. They are looking at the history of pools in Fort Worth, and they interviewed pretty much everybody that has any opinions about pools. But the end result is that many, many pools that Fort Worth had over the years and decades have closed down. And there are few, if any, public pools left in Fort Worth. And the Parks Department does say that they believe that the reason that pools weren't included in bond packages were because that those were not brought, citizens did not request them. I heard from a lot of citizens while I was serving in office that thought that this was a negative thing that we were doing by closing pools. And I saw the results of people not knowing how to swim when our high rates of drowning in Fort Worth were revealed every year. So I think that this is definitely something that needs to be revisited. And thankfully, this is a win because it is being revisited. The city of Fort Worth is currently doing a master parks and recreation plan, and that will also include an aquatics plan. And so there are going to be some meetings coming up I'm looking through the article. I know they said when these meetings were going to be held, and I think this article does include those. So if I'm not able to find them to say them out loud on the pod, hopefully you will read the article. Oh, June of 2024 is when those meetings are going to kick off. But they're currently interviewing folks throughout the city to get input as to what parks and recreation could look like going forward, what improvements could be made so that they can then include that in citizen surveys so that they can get relevant and good feedback for that. So hopefully this will lead to an amazing win, which in my opinion would be to have a more robust parks program that includes pools where all people can swim. Because this article basically points out that the neighborhoods that were the most negatively impacted by the closing of pools were Black and brown communities, and that there's a disproportionate negative impact of those pools closing. That came up in our north side discussions around Panther Island. It's come up on the east side discussions, that basically the pools that exist in Fort Worth besides the two public pools that we have are country clubs and HOA neighborhoods where only people who live in those neighborhoods are able to access those pools.
And I think it's Rachel Barrett. And the reason why I've said that is because I messed up her name a couple times, but she's a listener to the pod, and I met her once, and I think she said, "No, you're saying it right."
Okay,
so,
good.
Barrett.
Apologize for that, Rachel. I get my last name mispronounced all the time.
Awesome. Well, guys, we are done with the episode. This is going to be the last episode with Ann for some time. This will be the longest you've been away. And so while you're gone, maybe, new circuits of creativity and observations, come back with some nuggets for all of us. I will not be here next week due to travel and work, but the next 2 weeks we will be having guests. I'm going to be playing it by ear currently of who those will be, but that will be my duty once we get off of this pod. You guys have been great. Thank you for listening.
Yep, I'm headed out of the country. I'll be going to Australia and New Zealand. And
come on, mate.
In the next couple of weeks, I'll be doing a 47-kilometer trek with a backpack on my back. So wish me luck. I hope I survive.
Wow. That is impressive. Man, that is impressive. It's going to be super cool. Awesome. Well, guys, thank you so much. We're back in action, and you guys, it's just good to see you guys, even though we were gone a couple weeks, just bouncing right back in, listening to the latest episodes. So it just allows us to know that even though our schedules have been a little hectic, you guys are still there with us.
We appreciate you.
Later.
Control your life, control your life.